Well, ladies and gentlemen, from the German to the EU, we now move on to a view that takes us to a global perspective. Quantum computing finding its place in the advanced computing sector is now. And Bob Sorensen will take us on a quick tour of the emerging quantum computing sector. He's Senior Vice President and Chief Analyst Quantum Computing at Hyperion Research and drives research in the EU, in the US, as well as in Asia Pacific. Bob, with that, the floor is yours.
Well, great. Thank you very much. I want to thank you and the organizers for inviting me to speak at this conference. The agenda to me is quite impressive, and I hope to, once I finish speaking, to really spend some time listening to some of the other speakers as well. Well, as introduced, my name is Bob Sorensen. I'm going to talk a little bit about quantum computing from a global perspective, not as technical a talk as perhaps others will be giving in the next 2 days. Just to give you, this isn't a commercial, but I come from a company called Hyperion Research, and our pedigree is really in high performance computing. We've spent many years looking at some of the high performance computing developments from a global perspective, from a technology, competitive, and government perspective. And the reason I lay that out is to give you a sense that we have come to explore what's going on in the quantum world because our high performance computing clients are very interested in how quantum is going to change the trajectory of advanced computing writ large. They want to know what are the challenges and opportunities and how quantum will actually start to change what's going on in the advanced computing sector as an overall industry in terms of capabilities, in terms of what needs to be done, what are some of the challenges, and going forward. So let's just jump into that the talk right away. Sirs, over the next day or two, you're going to hear from a lot of folks who are going to tell you that the promise of quantum computing is substantial. There are lots of areas where quantum computing can exceed the performance of conventional classical computers for important problems in physical simulations such as material science, chemistry, pharmaceuticals, oil and gas sector, in areas of machine learning, artificial intelligence applications, and as well as in optimization, the idea of taking a problem and doing it a little more efficiently or at a lower cost or with a better time to solution. And what's interesting is the list of use cases and applications in the quantum computing sector grows longer every day. There's so much innovation right now. There are so many different research organizations, quantum computing developers, as well as end users who are really looking to try to expand and extend the range of what quantum can do for them. Now, one of the things you'll hear mentioned frequently is this demonstrate a so-called goal of quantum supremacy, which means using a programmable quantum device to solve a problem no classical computer can solve in any feasible length of time. And the classic example you'll hear is people refer to Shor's algorithm, which in its essence offers the ability to factor a large number into its two prime integers in times that what would take perhaps an hour or sub-hour, maybe a matter of minutes on a quantum computer, theoretically, could take the longer on a classical counterpart than perhaps the age of the universe. So there are some examples of this in terms of what quantum supremacy offers. But the bottom line is for a lot of end users, they're not looking for quantum supremacy. And so the goal of what quantum can bring to an existing or expected workload in the advanced computing field is not ultimately seeking quantum supremacy, it's seeking performance gains. And I'll get into that discussion a little bit as we move through this deck. But one of the things you're going to find out if you look at what's going on in the quantum world, you find out quite quickly is right now there are a broad range of technology contenders. This is not a case as we see in the classical world where the question becomes, do I use an Intel microprocessor or an AMD microprocessor or an ARM microprocessor or something coming out of, say, the EPI initiative? There are distinct and very diverse ranges of what we call modalities to implement the quantum phenomena to build a quantum system that are very different. And we have things like superconducting quantum qubits that operate at cryogenic temperatures, photonics that use photons, trapped ions, spin quantum dot, adiabatic, topological, which is more of a theoretical right now than a practical idea. But the point here is that each of them offers their unique strengths and weaknesses, and there may not be a clear winner in the next few years. And ultimately, the winner that triumphs in terms of quantum computing may not even be in this circle just yet. So understand that this is a very nascent technology. We haven't even decided yet if it's not like deciding which operating system you want to use. We haven't even decided yet if we're going to use electrons or photons or some other modality to actually achieve quantumness. So be careful when you hear about different organizations and different developments because they have some very unique strengths and they all have some very unique weaknesses. And if you talk to companies to the extent that I do, you'll find that there's one thing that they all agree on. Their particular quantum choice is the one that has the most promise. That's a universal truth when you talk to any of these developers. So look for the strengths, try to identify the weaknesses when you're trying to evaluate which quantum contender may be the one that is best at this particular point in time. If I haven't given you a hint by now, you probably realize that there are some substantial challenges ahead in bringing quantum to making it a classic kind of stable IT market sector. As I mentioned earlier, there are formidable technical issues in quantum hardware and software, lots of algorithm development, but quantum computing is not something that is inherently obvious to a lot of people. The math is different, the underlying science is different, and there are some formidable technical issues there. The performance gains are uncertain. The sector will move in fits and starts. There will be some gains, there'll be some setbacks, but the idea of expecting periodic and regular performance gains like we have come to expect from the classical computing sector is just not simply going to happen. And that leads to unclear timeframes in terms of when quantum will reach certain levels of performance and when they'll be able to demonstrate clear performance advantage in certain applications. One of the things that we're interested in looking at is looming workforce issues. This is a growing sector, and it's something where finding the food chain of either graduates or converting existing advanced computing experts in, say, software development, hardware, software engineering, to come to the quantum space is something that a lot of organizations are looking at and struggling with. Well, all these factors complicate, as I said, treating quantum computing as a stable market. And why we've stressed the need for stable market is because making a business case at the C-suite level for dealing with quantum, for bringing it into an organization is tough, but it does need to be done to ensure the continued success and progress of the sector. So what things need to be recognized here are use cases. Can we find compelling use cases where quantum clearly demonstrates a performance advantage or at least some value added from a competitive perspective over using of a classical counterpart? Are there revenue gains involved? It would be really nice to demonstrate that this market is stable, and I'll talk a little bit about that going forward. And ultimately, customer acquisition process. Are we gaining more customers, more end users in the sector who are dipping their toe in the water, who are trying to explore not only where quantum computing is going, but what it can bring to their particular business application, their advanced computing agenda, whether it be in the commercial sector, government sector, or academia. Now, the one thing I do want, the big takeaway I want to get from this, and I have to remind many of my colleagues in the U.S. that quantum is a global phenomenon. This is not something that any particular country or region owns in any great capacity just yet. It is really a wide open field of research. And the chart on the left here, which I ran yesterday just to make sure I had updated it, I just did a simple search on Scopus, looking at leading R&D publications in the last 5 years, using a very simple search to try to isolate what I consider to be a broad brush stroke of quantum computing. And I found about 17,000 documents published over those last 5 years. And this just gives you a sense of, if you look at the chart on the left, there's a few takeaways here. The first one is the United States and China are clearly publishing the most R&D papers in quantum computing, but there are an awful lot of other countries in the world who are right up there in terms of participation. Certainly, to the extent that there's no great leadership here yet. And this is only the top 10, I believe. I could list another 25 different countries in this list that published at least 25 research papers during the time frame we examined. The other takeaway from that chart on the left is you'll notice that most countries, the trend is upward. This is an area where research is not only proliferating geographically, but also over time. Most countries are increasing their rate and trend in research publications. Now, one of the things I found most interesting comes out of the chart on the right, where if we look at that publication count by affiliation, I love the diversity of this particular graphic. We see a participation from China, the CNRS facility in France, MIT in the United States. We have the Delft University of Technology from the Netherlands, University of Waterloo from Canada, University of Oxford from the UK, and National University of Singapore. And this is just the top 10, but it really drives home, I think, the point. And by the way, this list goes on exhaustively for hundreds, if not thousands of smaller participants. But it is broad and diverse. And that's one of the things that I think is really important to understand about quantum, is the fact that it is a global phenomenon at this point. There's no leaders, There's no legacy advantage. There is no guaranteed, we've been in it longest, so we win mentality here. This is a wide open field. And that's really been driven home by just this list of, and these are just select national regional government quantum programs around the world. And you can see there's a broad range of what I would call usual suspects. The key here is that this is not unique in the sense that there is not only one EU program in quantum. There is only not one German program in quantum. This is just the one that struck me as most interesting when I was putting together this graphic. So the point here is there are many government programs driving quantum computing in many different directions. And again, as I said earlier, it is a global phenomenon. What this means is that because of the interest in quantum, there is the growing list of, say, quantum computing hardware suppliers. And what's interesting is the diversity of these players. We have what I would call legacy players, IT organizations that have been deeply involved in classical computing, but are looking at quantum as well. And I would point to companies like Fujitsu, IBM, and Atos as a legacy player. Then we have what I would call the integrated players, a company like Honeywell, where they basically came out of stealth mode, announcing basically they've been looking at quantum computing for perhaps over a decade. But the statement made by one of their vice presidents was fascinating to me. He said, Honeywell may be our greatest customer when it comes to our quantum computing supply. They do things like integrated electronics, avionics, and other advanced computing capabilities that are integrated into finished systems. So they may not be looking to be a supplier as much as a consumer of their own technology. And certainly there are a number of new entrants out there with the pure play organizations like IonQ, Regretti, Cold Quantum, Quantum Circuits, and such, where they basically organizations funded primarily through venture capital money that have stood up and said, we have a great idea and let's move forward. There are component players such as Intel that are trying to leverage their semiconductor production capabilities into thinking about how they can bring capability to what's going on in the quantum sector. There's a raft of what I consider to be non-traditional players. And if you look at this list and scratch your head, you'll go, hey, this is interesting. These are all cloud service providers. They're also very interested in not only providing access to some of the quantum computing vendors that I've talked about above here, but also developing their own in-house capabilities, which I find a very interesting dynamic that brings an interesting new perspective to the supplier base. And I cannot tell you how many stealth players there are out there, organizations that have a good idea and have managed to secure funds and are really coming up with finding some particular slice of the quantum computing ecosystem where they can bring some of their capabilities to bear. And I certainly would be remiss if I didn't point out the fact that the European commercial presence is substantial at this point. And in fact, one of my to-dos this year is to really try to have a much better understanding of what the dynamics are going on in the EU. Most of our clients, because they're US-based, really are looking at what's going on in the US, but I feel like we're certainly missing a huge part of the picture if we don't understand some of the interesting and dynamics in terms of what's going on in the EU supplier base, and in some sense, equally as important, what's going on in the potential EU customer base for quantum computing. So that's my to-do list for this year, and hopefully if I get invited back next year, I can tell you about some great successes we've had in thinking about addressing some of these issues. I throw this horrible eye chart up here, not to tell you that, my God, there's a huge number of quantum computing suppliers out there, which there are. But the bottom line is, or the top line in this case, is if you look across the top line and you see, say I'm on top left, I'm a company called 1QBit, and I pick which hardware modality, which particular hardware vendor does my software work on. And what you'll see is the general trend in quantum computing right now in terms of the stack is the hardware software stack is starting to coalesce where a company like 1QBit can deal with a number of different hardware vendors. Their software runs on Amazon, D-Wave, Honeywell, IBM, Microsoft, Rigetti. What it means is that if you're a startup or you're thinking about dipping your toe into quantum computing algorithm or software development, you don't have to pick a winner in terms of a hardware company just yet. And what this means is from a stack perspective, it means that some of the advances that are going on in the software world have much more wide applicability than if there was the requirement for specific applications to run on specific hardware for specific companies. So I find this to be a very satisfying result in terms of alleviating workforce. One software developer can actually provide interesting algorithms to a number of vendors. The market doesn't have to stovepipe just yet. So I put this up here as a chart to say, hey, this is a really good news story in terms of how the software stack is evolving to address a myriad of different hardware vendors. Well, we did actually, we're called upon to do a market forecast this time last year. And we ended up interviewing about 250 different quantum computing organizations, be they quantum computing suppliers or vendors or researchers, as well as a large tranche of quantum computing users or companies who are potentially thinking about quantum computing users. And we asked about things like budget and procurement plans and how it would fit into their overall business organization. And after all that was done, we basically came up with a projection based on all the data we collected from those 250 organizations that in 2020, the quantum market was worth about $320 million, and that we were expecting an anticipated compound aggregate growth rate for the next 4 years of about 27%. We found that on-prem and cloud access hardware will be about 50% of the market. And as I mentioned earlier, what we call kind of the Holy Trinity, if you will, of quantum computing right now, optimization, physical simulation, and machine learning will nearly equally divide the algorithm space. I mentioned early on about the specter of quantum superiority, of writing programs that are only possible on a quantum computing and intractable on a classical counterpart. Well, we tried to delve a little more deeply into what that meant from the user perspective. So as I said, we did a study early last year, and we talked to, I want to say, about 140 different quantum computing end users and potential quantum computing end users that were companies that identified themselves as those that were perhaps going to purchase or at least dip their toe into quantum computing into their existing compute workload, say in the next 3 years. And some of the numbers we came out with when we said, what's the minimum performance gain you would require to justify using quantum computing for your existing and planned workloads? And the number we found that was most fascinating, and it's the bullet on the right there in the middle, that says 42% of the companies we talked to said if you give us 50x or below, so that's 50x or 10x or 5x or 2x, if you give us that performance